We've sent the links. Let's wait for everybody to come in.
The stream looks pretty smooth.
Hello. Hey, my friend. Hello.
Hello, please remain muted when you are in the Zoom call. Thank you.
Can you repeat after me? Allahu Akbar.
Again, please remain muted when you are in the Zoom call.
Allahu Akbar.
Hello everyone, we'll be starting at 5:20, which is 8 minutes from now. So invite your friends, make them come inside. Okay, hello everyone. It is 5:20. We shall now begin. So before we start the lecture and introduce our speaker, we would like to share a few reminders. When you are in the Zoom call, please remain muted and keep your video cam off at all times. Use the chat strictly for questions related to the lecture itself. Third, be respectful and engaging in the discussion if you were to have one. We reserve the right to remove you from the call if you do not follow these rules. So, with that out of the way, let's introduce our speaker. She is a living legend in the Philippine debating community and in the global debating community as well. She has a number of achievements, first of which being the co-CA of the World Universities Debating Championships. She's also a three-time Philippine national champion and has expanded her influence of debating knowledge all across the globe. She's also a three-time Asian champion. And to prove that she is qualified for our discussion today, she is a PhD candidate in gender studies at the University of Cambridge and is a Gift Scholar. It is our honor to introduce our lecturer for today, Ms. Sharmila Parmanand.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the lecture. All right, great. I have access to chat. I'm just sending Tim a message. Cool. All right. So I'm really excited to be here. I will try my best to monitor chat as the lecture continues, so that if people have any questions in the middle or if there's any term that's not clear to them, send that on chat so that I can address it as soon as possible. So maybe just some housekeeping things. I've divided this lecture into two parts. So the first part is more introductory stuff. So the basic frameworks and some of the basic debates that you'll hear. And the second part is a more sophisticated, slightly more philosophical discussion of, concepts like choice, consent, agency, freedom. And then we'll do case studies as well in the second part. So what I think we can do is go through the first session, take a quick break to answer questions, and then move on to the second session and answer questions again. For the first session, there is a slide with some key terms. So I'll probably pause after that slide as well to see if you have any questions, because that is a lot of material and it is quite dense. What else? Yeah, I think that's it, and we're good to start. Oh, sorry. Another disclaimer is I do try to talk about women and gender minorities here, but the disclaimer being that my research deals a lot with women or people who identify as women. And so naturally, that will probably be the set of examples I draw on a bit more. Okay. Let us now look at the introduction bit. So some key terms, I guess, that might be useful. And I suggest to you to actually read up a bit more on these terms. So there are a lot of resources online. Stonewall, which is an organization that advocates for LGBT rights, has very good discussion briefs on these topics. So just some key terms. So one is sex, which is a term you hear a lot. And in many cases, people tend to interchange sex and gender, which is quite problematic. And the distinction, probably the distinction we can draw there is sex is what is assigned to the person on the basis of primary sex characteristics or genitalia, essentially, right? Second, gender is often expressed in terms of masculinity and femininity, largely culturally determined and assumed from the sex assigned at birth. But actually, we'll realize that it is incorrect to do that, because a person's gender identity does not have to correspond to the sex at birth. And a person's gender identity is their kind of innate sense of gender, whether man, woman, a blend of both, or neither of those, right? Cis or cisgender means someone whose gender identity is the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. So you can be a cis straight person, you can be a cis lesbian, but as long as, let's say, you were designated female at birth and you identify as a woman, regardless of what your sexual orientation is or who you're attracted to, then you are cis, right? And some people would prefer to use the term non-trans. Trans is an umbrella term to describe people whose gender is not the same as, or does not sit comfortably with, the sex they were assigned at birth. But of course, this is a spectrum, because I guess even individuals who are not straight sometimes can experience some degree of discomfort with the sex assigned at birth, just because they are still not seen always as fully conforming to, expectations. But that's not the same as trans, right? So with trans, I think the discomfort is a bit more pronounced. In terms of orientation, it's an umbrella term used to describe a person's attraction. So that's really all there is to it. It is attraction, sexual or romantic, or a lack thereof, because that also exists. And these orientations can include lesbian, bi, ace, and straight. So ace would be the most common form that we know would be asexual, but you can also be aromantic or demis or questioning or uncertain. Now, so these are, I guess, a question some people ask is, why do we complicate things with like more precise labels of this sort? And these labels are not like a completely perfect fit for what they're trying to describe. I think an important reason we do this is because we want to recognize as much as possible the validity of different ways of being, of people's different relationships with their body, people's different conceptions of gender. Next, there was a very big debate around using the term cis, for example, because people felt, and I can see where this is coming from, that it became kind of like a way to distinguish, natural born individuals from trans individuals. So I do want to say that when in the context in which I'm using that term and the context in which LGBT advocates use that term is not exclusionary. In fact, it is to highlight that the cis way of being in the world is just one of the many different experiences. It's not special, it's not the default. And that's why it also gets a special name. It is just like one of those many different ways of engaging with the world, or like thinking about your body or thinking about your identity. And so I find that explanation to be quite persuasive. I mean, there are still many, many other terms. So the term non-binary is a term you might hear quite regularly. It is a person who does not identify with masculinity or femininity exactly, but sometimes may identify with certain forms of masculinity or femininity, and obviously presents or expresses this gender in multiple ways. So we can't conclude that a non-binary person must always express in this particular way. So even as we are developing more specific terms, these terms still are not, as precise. I think the best rule of thumb is always ask the person and defer to the person's self-assessment of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, recognizing also that sometimes they may not be able to express these things or present this way publicly because of safety concerns or stigma or privacy reasons. Anyway, so I wanted some of these terms to be clear in case we end up referring to them in the discussion, and because these are important conversations that are being had. In policy, we have the SOGI bill, but also like in debates. Cool. Now, so I said this would be an introduction to gender. The framework I still use is feminism to discuss gender debates. There are alternative perspectives that some people would argue fall within feminism. Some people would argue it's a very different branch. So queer studies is also a useful perspective. That is less my expertise. So I do think that a lot of what we want to tackle, we can still tackle within the feminist umbrella. but I do encourage you to also read a bit more thoroughly about queer theory. Okay, so when we think about feminism, it's such a loaded term. It's such a big word, right? So it's kind of useful to ask ourselves, what does this word mean and how do we unpack this word? I think there are that we can, three ways around which we can think of feminism. One is that it is a way of thinking about the world. So it's a lens that you put on, right? Like you try to understand social relationships, you try to understand oppression, you understand power structure using a specific lens, a feminist lens. And later on, we'll talk about what that lens means and collectivizing to advocate for change or to achieve specific goals. But apart from those two, and that exists for that change to scale. So feminism is big on personal practices as well, and I guess there is space for, I guess, feminist reflection. So even things like our conceptions of romantic and sexual relationships, or in the workplace, seeing, I guess, people's access to power or people's access to play here, or even very basic things like our own conceptions of our body, and even like weight or tendencies to body shame people, or our conceptions of what is beautiful. So there's a lot of room for feminist reflection, even in personal lives. But obviously, that shouldn't be divorced from like greater structural forms of oppression that we want to resist in an organized way, right? Okay, cool. The next, I think you've realized this important thing about feminism, or even like LGBT advocacy, which I consider to still be under feminism, is not all feminists think alike. Where they differ is largely on two things. One, on how they understand the causes of inequality. So, okay, we all agree that women and gender minorities are marginalized in various ways. And at the end of this slide, I'll point you to resources. But the question is, what causes this inequality? How do you explain it? And obviously, the way you explain it will have an effect on the kind of solutions you support or that you promote. And there's a lot of disagreement there, which is why you will have feminists who defend pornography and feminists who reject it, or feminists who think sex work is work, which I do, and feminists who do not. They think it's universally a form of violence against women. Likewise for polygamy, or feminists will disagree on what their relationship is with the police, many other practices and ideas that they may disagree on. And we'll talk about those disagreements in a bit. But where this becomes relevant for debating is debates often require you to defend a perspective or prioritize specific goals or groups over others, right? One thing I do want to trouble you with is, it has been asked, do women actually, just by virtue of being women, for example, do we actually share the same identity? Is there actually like a point in saying that we mobilize around the identity of a woman? If you think about it, think of a first world female corporate executive. Think of, Sheryl Sandberg running Facebook, and she talks to women about leaning in. She says, oh, part of the reason there's a pay gap, part of the reason there's a promotion gap is because we don't assert ourselves enough. We don't just like throw ourselves into whatever it is we're doing. Like, we need to push harder. We need to advocate for ourselves more and negotiate harder, which to me sounds a bit victim blamey, to be honest. And also, like, that is advice that you can apply or give from a position of privilege. Like, not every woman has that kind of leverage in her employment relationship or even personal relationships to be able to like aggressively push back against structures. In some cases, there are high costs to doing that, right? But anyway, imagine the lives of, these corporate executives, then compare it to the lives of, let's say, the female domestic helpers they hire, who are likely to come from less wealthy countries and who have left their own families, most likely, to care for other families, and the sense of alienation that these people face. Like, do they really, can you actually put them in the same box? Some people will say yes. or Black women and their relationship with the police, for example. For a lot of middle class white women in the US, the solutions to things like domestic violence or assault heavily involve engagement with the criminal justice system. Call the cops, sue the person, get them into jail. But like the police are seen as partners in, I guess, as partners in arriving at a solution. And I can understand where this perspective is coming from, because that is the role officially of cops, right? But then if you talk to some Black feminists, they don't share the same kind of optimism in relation to the police, because they don't have the same historical relationship with the police. Um, there is a lot of police violence against Black women, actually, but for some reason, this doesn't seem to be highlighted enough. And there's a lot of focus on violence against men. Both actually happen. But also, like, to these women, they're not too keen on calling the cops, because a lot of times that results in an escalation of violence in their communities. Or maybe you're reporting your partner or your son or your brother, but you don't necessarily want for them to end up dead, but there's a very real reason that's what's going to happen. So there is historically a very different relationship with the police or the military from certain like social groups that's mediated by like class or ethnicity, right? So Taylor Swift, I quite like her in her later years, but at the same time, like, calling herself a feminist icon has made it like a bit, some people find it sketchy and say that she tends to get a bit more credit relative to other artists, largely because also of class and race positionality, right? So so women exist in different contexts in terms of access to reproductive rights, employment, burdens of care, restrictions we face on speech and dress. So the point I'm making here is, I'm making 2 points actually. One, that intersectionality is very, very important. Gender always intersects with race, class, religion. So in any analysis, always ask yourself, like, who are the more vulnerable actors in this situation? How does it impact them the most? And how do we ensure that our decision-making structures represent the opinions or the needs and interests of those most vulnerable actors? Because in every minority group, you're going to have elites, right? And a lot of times, those elites within the minority group do a very good job of representing what is good for them as what is good for the minority group. So in debates, being able to see when that is happening and call that out is quite valuable. So that is the first point. The second point I was making is, yeah, it is genuinely worth thinking about this category of woman. And a lot of research and a lot of work has been done to destabilize the fixedness of this category. We just talked about all the very different gender identities, and all of those identities, all of those people suffer marginalization relative to cis men. So maybe women don't have like special, self-identified women maybe don't have special monopoly over suffering or special purchase over suffering. So what does that do to how we imagine political action, right? All right. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to introduce the 4 different feminist frameworks and how they conceive of femininity and masculinity, how they understand the roots of oppression, and perhaps suggest some of the solutions that they are more likely to support. One thing I want to emphasize, though, is that this is not a neat distinction. So it's not a formula. You don't say, I fit into the liberal box, I fit into the socialist box, although that could be true for some women and some feminists or some thinkers. But think of this more as a conversation. And the reason I am splitting them up into 4 different categories is just to highlight to you the key differences. But these differences are actually not as pronounced in individual feminist practice. A lot of times I find myself taking a liberal position on one issue and a more socialist position on another issue, or kind of combining both and saying, well, let's do this first, but really this is the goal in the end, right? So don't lock yourself into a particular position. And even when you are using this in debates, don't say, oh no, we can only argue the liberal frame here. There's no space for something else. This is really just to introduce you to the different points of agreement and points of difference. And you can do with that information what you will, but don't be too rigid in how you think about it. Sorry. Okay, cool. So liberal feminists, the tendency of a liberal outlook is to focus a lot on the public sphere, right? So when you ask perhaps someone with a stronger liberal inclination, where does oppression come from? What they will say is oppression is rooted in legal and political constraints. Oh, in laws that prevent women from voting, in laws that prevent women from owning public property, perhaps the absence of anti-discrimination laws, right? But a lot of these are interventions in the public sphere. So the solution will be fix the public sphere, right? Change political procedures, change practices and institutions so that we have an equal playing field. But the thing that liberalism is the other thing that liberalism advocates is that individual agency and free choice are very, very important, right? So they kind of tend to think that it is probably possible for a person or a subject to kind of separate themselves from society. So you change society, you change the opportunity structure, and then you kind of assume that every other decision that a subject makes after that is free and informed. So if we have already allowed women officially to join the labor force, and if we've already allowed women to run for public office, and yet you still have mostly men, you can kind of write that off as the choice of women not to do it, right? So the interventions are generally a bit limited in touch because they're like, we don't want to intervene too much in people's choices or in structures. We will change the rules. We will assume that having changed them equalizes the playing field. Whatever outcomes after this are really just a matter of personal choice. Cool. Next. So the next one is the socialist feminists or socialist orientation. And they come in and say in conversation with liberals, no, that's not enough. And you hear the terms like, oh, superficial or token change, right? Or you're not going far enough. And in fact, the changes you advocate end up strengthening the pre-existing structure. Socialist feminists would say, look, women's oppression is a product of capitalistic political and economic structures, right? Men predominantly control the wealth in the world. And if you control the means of production, and if you control economic resources, you inevitably also control ideology because you control the predominant ways in which ideas and knowledge is produced and legitimized and normalized. You run the media stations, you run the academic institutions and kind of determine how we produce knowledge or who the authorities are, who shapes norms, right? And also obviously the link between economic power and political power is very important. So socialist feminists also tend to say, look, the market is actually really, really gendered. So to the liberal feminists who tend to be more, I guess, more optimistic about the market, socialist feminists will say this optimism about the market is a bit misguided because if you think about how the capitalist market allocates entitlements and responsibilities, it's very, very gendered. Even the distinction we make between paid and unpaid labor is very, very gendered, right? Like, if you think about it, what goes into the GDP would be things that are bought or sold. What is not measured there is the labor that a lot of times is quite feminized and gendered, that women perform at home to cook, to clean, to raise kids. And these are not valued at all. These are treated as unpaid labor, invisible work, but actually the entire system will collapse in the absence of this kind of work, right? And so with this outlook, socialist feminists are actually more inclined to work not just with women, but with all other groups, especially marginalized groups, because the logic is, look, oppression of women is part of a larger pattern of oppression within the capitalist system. Cool. Now, radical feminists. So socialist feminists locates the oppression in capitalist structures. Radical feminists locates this in, I suppose, like this distinction between masculinity and femininity. So for radical feminists, the way they understand the problem is, we exist in a world where we tend to view the world through a binary, so where we identify certain traits as predominantly female or predominantly male. And we tend to privilege or prioritize these traits that are seen as male. And we tend to see them as like superior traits. So, for example, strength, logic, reason, assertiveness tend to be seen or as masculine traits, progress, whereas things like community, connection, tradition, capacity for caring tend to be seen as female. Now, whether this is actually like true or not in an essential way is a debate among feminists too. Like, I don't think any of these things are natural or inherent. I don't think women are inherently more peaceful than men, and that's been disputed. In situations where women are in a position to use violence, they have. In fact, there is a lot of support for war among women. It's not even as if women are all opposing the war, opposing wars, despite the stereotype, right? So anyway, but the argument of radical feminists is, look, if we're going to view the world that way, and it might actually be true that women, for some of them, that women are inherently more nurturing or more caring, then the intervention that we need is to actually value these women, these feminine traits, as opposed to devaluing them, right? Let us reshape social norms to actually emphasize more feminine identified norms like community, connection, capacity for caring. So if you look at our justice system, for example, let's focus instead on rehabilitation and caring and compassion rather than revenge and punishment. So liberal feminists might say, oh, we want women joining the military so that is a sign of equality because women can be just as good as men in fighting. Whereas radical feminists might say, but no one wins if that happens. When in fact, what we want to do is not make women more masculine, but it is to challenge certain forms of masculinity, actually. So the solution might be to not support militarism rather than join it and be militaristic, right? Another thing that radical feminists are concerned about is sexual oppression of women. Some of them do tend to have quite a pessimistic view of sexual relations and tend to suggest that sexual relations, especially in a heterosexual context, are always exploitative or imbalanced. And there's a very strong opposition to pornography and prostitution because they feel that one way masculine men have been trained, or society has been trained to express masculinity, is through the sexual domination of women. And so they kind of, if that is your premise, that masculinity is expressed through the sexual domination of women, then you tend to take quite a pessimistic view of sex acts in general. Obviously, some feminists will strongly disagree with this idea. Okay. So postmodern feminism rejects unitary or binary understandings of the world gender, including as the male and female sex. So not only are they opposed to gender, they think that sex itself is a biological construct, right? So, is a construct. So the fact that when we are born, to them, you are not born male or female. You're simply born as a human body, right? But the fact that you are designated male or female, that's not something that is natural or factual. That itself is an intervention. The mere division of babies into male or female based on primary characteristics and nothing else is in itself socially constructed, right? So for them, there's space to say that that is not the best way to class individuals, and that itself is influenced by gender, actually. So it's the other way around. Our conceptions of male and female are what kind of lead us then to designate people into our conceptions of man and woman are what lead us to designate people into male or female. And fair enough, there is some like truth to this. You see individuals who are intersex, right? Or you see people sexed as designated as female or designated as male, who even biologically do not necessarily like conform to what you'd expect as the norm for those sexes, which shows us like how unstable really these categorizations are, even if we pretend as a society that they're fixed and that they are natural. So for them, identity is actually performatively created. It's not natural. We kind of like repeatedly perform a specific thing until it becomes innate. Now, the argument here isn't that we are all acting on a stage. Like, obviously, social norms do bear upon us in a way that we internalize a lot of these norms. So we experience these things as real and as true and as innate. But I think what these kinds of these feminists want to tell us is to reflect a bit more on whether this is really innate or whether this is just very, very strong social conditioning. So what they would support then is to denaturalize sex roles, reject the basis of reject mandatory heterosexuality, reject the assumption that everyone is like heterosexual unless proven otherwise, reject this conception that male and female are natural, the natural order of things. Okay, so as we've said, how the group defines the problem affects how they would like to solve it. And I won't go into detail for these case studies yet because we are discussing them in the next section. But keep in mind some of the motions you've encountered, like supporting the full decriminalization of sex work. So basically, we are removing laws that ban it, right? Or rejecting cosmetic surgery, banning the hijab, abortion. All of these things kind of go back to questions of choice and questions of how do we understand the problem. Let's talk about some debates here that are less to do with choice and perhaps more to do with political strategy or which interests are being prioritized. So there's a big debate about whether women's spaces, women-only spaces are valuable. I want to make clear right away that for me, the debate on whether trans women belong in women's spaces is a settled debate for me. I think it is very difficult to justify excluding trans women from women-only spaces on the basis that women need a space to feel safe from oppression, especially because trans women are among the biggest targets of oppression and violence. So I do not imagine a world where we think, oh, trans women are the threat, because in fact, many times trans women are the victims. So to me, if someone identifies as a woman, we accept that they are a woman. But the question of women-only spaces relative to perhaps cis men or people who identify as men is still a debate. And the argument for this would be, historically, women did not have as much access to political power, the power to set the agenda, or the power to speak without interruption or without misrepresentation or without any cost to speaking, such that there still is a residue of that now. And also, like, a lot of women have experienced like gender-based violence, usually not always, with male perpetrators, right? So there is a need for like a space, a more non-judgmental atmosphere where women can like make sense of their experiences together, and give those experiences a name, which is not always possible in mixed spaces. So sometimes simply identifying like certain things on the agenda become more important, like women's health, women's psychology, like experiences of assault and things like that, that might be hard to discuss comfortably outside these spaces, or spaces for rehabilitation and healing for trauma survivors. So that would probably be the defense of this, or like for women to define their agenda without like, I guess, without contamination, or without like it being hijacked by other actors, who might make it about their interests, right? um, and fair enough, because in situations where there is, there is a history of, in situations where we have had co-ed spaces, women's interests have had to take the back seat. So I can think of two examples. One, if you think about like nation building or revolutionary movements or anti-colonial movements, right? Like it's always like everyone supports the revolution, but women's rights take a back seat. When the revolution does succeed, women are promised, yes, 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 later on we will like focus on women's rights, but now we kind of have to set that aside for a goal. And then when it does succeed, women's rights are still taking a back seat. So even in like co-ed spaces, the decision making hasn't always like been equitable towards women. Or even if you think of how a lot of unions function, not all, but labor unions and their women members feel like their interests are kind of deprioritized sometimes. So interests for paternal leave or anti-employment discrimination tend to get subjugated to interests that are seen as for all the workers. But a lot of times, when we say all, we mean men. That is how even the whole idea of human rights, right, was not equally accessible to men and women. So fair enough. I guess the case for women's spaces is historical subjugation of women's agenda and voices and interests. Which then brings us to another debate, which is the role of cis men in feminist orgs. So I personally think men can be allies. And besides, even if you have a cynical view, I do not think it's really possible to achieve social change without getting the buy-in of everyone else we live in this world. Like that is kind of what it means to live in a democracy, right? So some people are a bit more skeptical of working alongside male allies. I am not. But obviously there's a debate about taking up space, making sure that the agenda is still driven and controlled by the primary stakeholders in the movement. But at the same time, like if we are trying to change conceptions of masculinity, then we do need to, I think we do need to, I suppose, like encourage alternative models of masculinity that are healthier and not toxic, even if it still conforms to masculinity. So some people have a problem with he for she feminism, for example. I don't know if you're old enough to remember Emma Watson and her he for she speech, where you kind of have all these like attempts at persuading men to be more feminist. So explaining to them that it is in their interest to do so, or saying things like she's someone's daughter, or imagine if this happened to your sister or your mother, or real men don't rape, or real men don't hit women. So some people are like, but you're still upholding the framework of masculinity. It's just a different masculine archetype. This time you're upholding the archetype of the protector rather than the aggressor. And I'm like, yeah, I understand where this opposition is coming from. At the same time, I do think if you're trying to do advocacy on the ground, you can't just completely do away with these conceptions of masculinity and femininity. Perhaps one intervention might be to expand them and to encourage healthier versions of masculinity, like more involved parenting for fathers, less violence and aggression. And I think that's valuable too. But that's a debate. There is another debate as well in terms of the role of straight allies in LGBT orgs, like how I guess, how well can straight allies represent the cause? Should they even be representing the cause? What are our obligations as straight allies to LGBT individuals? To be honest, when I was younger, probably even now, a big part of my opposition to marriage is because if I engaged in it, I would feel like I am betraying my LGBT friends because I have access to a right or privilege, if you think of being married as a privilege, that they don't have. And therefore, I am strengthening an institution that is essentially that essentially functions to delegitimize the relationship or to distinguish between acceptable and less acceptable forms of relationships, right? So, like, as a straight ally, what is our role in all of this? This debate as well of like Western feminism failing the developed world is quite interesting. But I think I won't go into detail about this because this is actually covered quite extensively in the second part. All right, more common debates that you encounter. So things like radical approaches versus more socially acceptable or reformist ones. So do we want like confrontational approaches? There's a big debate now about hypersexualization in pride parades, for example. Like even some members of the LGBT community are getting a bit uncomfortable at like very overt displays of genitalia and like sexual behavior in these parades. But at the same time, there's an argument of, yeah, because for the longest time, so, so I'm actually delving into the sexualization theme here. For the longest time, we have been held to norms that tie sex to marriage, that like have very conservative conception of sex that are not actually equally applied. Like men could be publicly sexual, women couldn't, members of gender minorities couldn't. And so this is kind of like subverting those norms and reclaiming those norms. And the shock and awe has an element of like destabilizing and transgressing those norms, right? But at the same time, does it not reinforce conceptions of sexual deviance that lead society to be less accepting of these individuals? And within those minority groups, right? So within, among people who identify as women or among people who identify as queer or LGBT, not everyone is hypersexualized. Not everyone is as comfortable with their sexuality because sexualization doesn't happen on a neutral plane, right? Like some bodies are seen as more desirable than others. And so inherent in sexualization is, I guess, certain bodies are going to be more accepted than others. Now, some can argue that the solution is more sexualization of all bodies. Fine, but some can argue that the moment you start playing the sexualization game, some bodies are just naturally going to be excluded or less welcome. Even our acceptance of trans women, for example, I've noticed, tends to still be very um, conditional on attractiveness or on how well they pass for quote unquote, I hate this term, real women. So the celebration of trans women in beauty pageants, of course I think they should be in beauty pageants. I don't think this is even debatable. But at the same time, those are not the only trans women that should be accepted, right? Like, and we seem to be a bit more excited the more beautiful they are, beautiful in the conventional sense. So sexualization, I guess, should give us pause. How comfortable are the constituencies of a movement with it? How might it lead the movement to be viewed externally? But also, what are the new hierarchies? What are the new hierarchies, or what are the old hierarchies that might be recreated with a very sexualized paradigm? Uh, I do think the sexualization debate plays out a little differently for LGBT debates, well, especially gay men, as it does for women. Because with women, I guess you can argue that the subversion here is greater in that sex has always been tied to procreation and norms of modesty have always been applied more to women than they have to men. With gay men, though, the sexualization component exists in the context of they were not seen as practicing an acceptable form of like sexual attraction. So but they have always been seen as sexual beings. So in fact, what they're reacting against is, so your stereotype of promiscuity applies more to gay men than it would to women. So it's both are navigating sexual expectations, but slightly different ones. And so the resistance story is also a bit different, right? Okay. Highlighting does the movement highlight their difference or their similarity? So this to me is a really interesting debate for the LGBT movement and marriage, right? And even like how people make use of the rights discourse. Notice how whenever sexual rights are granted, it's always couched in the language of love, right? Love wins. What if I kind of just like sex without the love? Which is a question, a lot of gender minority individuals are asking. Actually, everyone might be asking, or maybe not everyone, but like people who decouple sex from love, right? Where does that leave you? In fact, granting sexual rights on the basis of love is quite, if you ask me, conservative conception of sexual rights. And some people in the LGBT community might feel that the prioritization of marriage as a political goal is really a prioritization of, oh, how do we make ourselves look more heterosexual? How do we signal that we can be like you too? We too can have two parents and children in a middle class neighborhood with access to the middle class lifestyle. What kind of like LGBT lives are then rendered as legitimate, as worthy of acceptance and deserving of respect? And what does that do to people who don't conform to that, right? Which is an argument I actually, have sympathy for. At the same time, you could argue what the liberals would say, which is, formal equality is a really important step to future equality. Like the fact that the law makes a distinction between you and other people already signals your inferiority. So if you can get the law to a place where they say you can have whatever heterosexuals have, then after that base, you can decide the sequence of your future advocacy, which is like to then lobby for other things. Also an argument that I have a lot of sympathy for. So should we work with the police? We've already talked about this earlier, and it kind of comes up again in the discussion on choice. So I'm going to leave that for now. Should we work with religious institutions? I think is a very interesting debate. Some people will say absolutely no, but the feminist movement has also received some backlash here for kind of just assuming that feminists must always be secular and not operate within a religious framework. But actually, you do have religious feminists. You have feminist theologians. You have Islamic feminists who still believe in that religious framework, but kind of believe that it can be reinterpreted. So they basically the argument is I don't have to choose between my God, my religious belief, my religious community, and my commitment to feminism or female equality, because it is possible to reformulate my religion in a way that makes it more gender equal. Personally, I am not persuaded by this, but I also believe very strongly that that is not my decision to make, or that is not a decision feminist movements should be making for other women, right? And in fact, you could argue both ways, right? You could argue that, which is the argument I believe, that religions are very slow to change. It is impossible to find change from within because some of these things are like just doctrinally accepted / the leadership structure is predominantly male and very resistant to change. And there's no real incentive to change because like the funding and the attendance and the support is tied to the more conservative base. So if they have to choose, they'll choose the more conservative base. That's my thought. But at the same time, you could also argue that historically religions have changed and they are purposely vague enough to make room for multiple interpretations precisely to accommodate a wider range of members. Also, they could change without necessarily admitting that they are changing because of women's rights, right? They can, when a religion when religion changes its policy or changes its emphasis, it can easily do so by finding another theological basis for the change in a way that allows it to save face, right? So it can point to social justice or like reconciliation and forgiveness as a basis for changing, but actually change. So perhaps change is actually possible. And historically, there has been a movement towards change anyway. And in some cases, it is simply impossible to advocate for LGBT rights or feminist rights without engaging with religion or getting the buy-in of religion. If I existed in a really conservative society, it is probably in my interest to get religious leaders to, I guess, get with the program in terms of my messaging. So when I argue that, or when I advocate for against domestic violence, when I try to persuade a society that men do not have an inherent right to beat their wives, or that in cases of botched abortions, women should be given emergency care instead of being left to die on the operating table, I probably will not be able to successfully persuade my community to do that on my own. And I probably do need religious leaders to support me in that. And there are very real, I guess there are very real implications in people's lives here for us to simply dismiss working with religious organizations. Of course, that comes with a cost. The cost here is if we've legitimized the religious organizations as partners, we have legitimized their authority. And it kind of makes it harder to turn around and criticize them in the future on something else. So in a way, we kind of are like binding ourselves to their authority, but at the same time, the more urgent cases of abuse, we gain more traction in preventing it, right? And this is why I say there's no formula to feminism. And that's why these debates are quite interesting. The role of funding and commercialization is also, increasingly salient. There's a big debate about the increasing commercialization of pride parades, because you see all these like big companies that want to signal that they are progressive, sponsoring pride parades for mileage. And some people are uncomfortable with this because they say, look, you are the same companies that discriminate against people of color, that discriminate against Blacks, that discriminate against lower income individuals or trans individuals at the early stages of hiring. Maybe you might have one or two or several, high level management individuals who are gay, usually gay men. Most of them will probably be white, middle class, and privileged. It doesn't mean they don't experience discrimination, but again, they are the more elite members of the minority group. And that's really who this is about. But it allows companies to whitewash the abuses they commit to more vulnerable members of the constituency. So that's problematic. And obviously, the moment you have them in your parades or in your events, and again, like I said, it becomes harder to criticize them, or some people might argue it becomes easier to criticize them, which is also persuasive, because the moment that they have put themselves out there as LGBT friendly, and then they don't do something that is LGBT friendly, or it's exposed that they have problematic practices, then they kind of get their woke card revoked, right? So in some ways, by them making a commitment to this, it is a way to hold them to that commitment. I am not as optimistic, but the case can be made in debates for this. So yeah, what role do corporations have in social movements is quite an interesting debate as well. All right, this is the end of part one. The other thing I want to leave you with is, a lot of times when discussing women's oppression, and this is just one example of data you can find, that's why I said go to the Stonewall site as well. You get asked for an evidence base because some people are just like in denial of this. Well, here's some examples. Women are disproportionately underrepresented in politics. And this isn't because they're not qualified. It's just because they're not winning or they're not being fielded by their parties in the first place. I mean, the Hillary and Trump thing should be a clear-cut indication, right? That sexism does play a part in politics. I'm not saying that's all there is to her defeat. She obviously wasn't speaking to the left as part of the party well enough. Her voters were complacent. The campaign was probably not very strategic, fine. But at the same time, women tend to get punished for seeking power. So there's a study here. I might attach it actually to this lecture when it's put up. There's a study that shows that Hillary was really, really popular for most of her career, except at moments when she sought a higher office. Then that's when her popularity would dip. So we're happy to see women succeed and women like perform well as long as they don't seek more power, right? And in fact, like her likability was always a problem. So people were always like, Hillary has a likability problem. And fair enough, the comparison to Bill or Obama, I think it's already very gendered. But if the comparison was to Trump, who was saying all these like really like rude and unpleasant things, why is Hillary's likability still the problem, right? Which shows you like how gendered it is. The other thing is like Hillary was well known for her cackle, her laugh in interviews. Like commentators would always point out the Hillary cackle and like allusions to being a witch. But actually, when people did research on this, it turns out that she was not laughing any more than your average man in interviews. In fact, she was laughing less. But because this is a woman, you know, displaying laughter, people are afraid of women's laughter, right? I mean, so many other things that can be said about that, like female politicians and the fence that that they have to straddle. If they are too emotional or warm or likable, they are in danger because of the stereotype that women don't have the hard logic and dispassion to make difficult decisions. But then if they are too, you know, cool and calm and logical, then they're seen as not likable. So you really can't win. It's a double bind, right? Economic empowerment, the stats speak for themselves. Women are half of the agricultural labor force. You own less than 20% of land. And we all know how valuable land is as an asset, right? You borrow against it. You don't have to pay rent. You rent it out and make passive income from it. Obviously, you are at a disadvantage economically if you have no land. And gender-based violence, which you can read for themselves when I just put up the slides later. All right, this is the end of part 1. There is a part 2 coming up. I am going to stop share for now and pause for questions. Feminist strategies. To be honest, I'm not sure how that motion is formulated, but that is, I guess it depends on the case studies we are dealing with, right? Like the advantage of using more Western accepted terms or strategies would be it is easier to form transnational alliances among these groups and to mobilize support for your cause. So it's easier to access funding if you are using a vocabulary or a set of concepts or frameworks that are more familiar to the sources of funding. It is easier to lobby other governments to lobby your government if the cause is presented in a way that is legible to them or that is understandable to them. And then I would also argue that a lot of these quote unquote Western feminist strategies are actually not as exclusive as the other side is arguing, right? So we always have this conception that, oh, if it is from the West, it is immediately exclusionary. But that doesn't have to be the case. So for example, the term queer is actually a really, really vast and broad term. So I guess I would argue two things. One, I would argue that within these strategies, there's a lot of space to accommodate some local frameworks, but obviously you have to bite the trade-off, right? But you might be using terms that the local community might not necessarily identify with. But that doesn't necessarily mean like it is changing their experiences or doing violence to them necessarily. So so first I would do some defensive work of minimizing uh the exclusionary component of what you were defending, and then I would move on to talking about the benefits of transnational activism. And I guess like there's increased expertise when it comes to these paradigms because they've been like investigated and they've been like discussed, so they've evolved to the point that people actually know how to mainstream these things, or they can advise organizations on how to um, reorient their service delivery and their mission statements to adopt these frameworks. So since you already have that like wealth of knowledge and resources that exist, why not tap into that as opposed to reinventing the wheel? Might be how I would package it. This is quite tricky though as a motion. To share with you my own experience in my research, I work with sex workers. It's not a very mainstream term in the Philippines because people like using prostitutes, which I am less, or women in prostitution, which I really dislike as a term. Because I do think that it is work. And in the same way we say the domestic workers are factory workers, right? Now, you know what's interesting is in the Philippines, we don't have a Filipino word for sex worker. We do have Filipino words for prostitute, which I would really rather not repeat. Um, and that to me was challenging because I'm like, if I don't want to impose a paradigm here that is not indigenous or that is not native. But then when I asked my interviewees, who are all sex workers, how to describe themselves, the way they would describe themselves as nagtatrabaho kami, nagtitinda kami ng sex o ng ligaya, naghahanap buhay kami, right? So in a lot of their descriptions, the emphasis was on the work part anyway. And so I realized, while it is not the perfect fit, it is more accurate to call it sex work than anything else. Even if this was a term that my own interviewees did not all immediately identify with, it was still the closest fit because the focus was on the working part rather than the sex part, right? So yeah, these are tricky because it also assumes that the local groups or local experiences have well-developed frameworks and strategies, which they kind of sometimes just don't. Okay. Any other questions on this front before we move? Okay. All right. So let's talk about Philippines. So I want to be honest here and say that I have not followed this debate as closely. So please don't take my opinion here to be an expert opinion. This is a very modest opinion. And, for all we know, I could revise my position down the line after learning more about it. My sense of understanding here is there are two issues at play. One, we are talking about two sets of experiences that are both in some ways related but distinct. So being the experience of being Filipino in the context of living in the Philippines permanently or predominantly, and the experience of being Filipino in the context of US society, being part of a diasporic community, and that hybrid identity. And obviously there are some things in common, but there are also some things that are quite different. So that is, I guess, one area of difference. And the other area of difference is conception of like gender binarity. So there seems to be a conception that Filipino, and because of the presence of Filipina as well, is a more like gendered conception of the term, whereas some people will say Filipino is meant to be gender neutral already in and of itself. And so I think Philippines kind of wants to highlight the gender inclusivity of of the term or of the affiliation. I don't have strong feelings here, and I'm a bit worried about the debates getting really, really heated. I'm a fan of basically telling people to identify in a way that they are comfortable with. So maybe I'm giving you a slightly cop-out answer here, but my answer here is in the same way, like we don't force people to designate themselves as non-binary or to even like declare their pronouns unless they want to. This is one of those things where I'm like, you just choose the term that you are most comfortable with and that you think is a best fit with your identity and historical experience, while also keeping an open mind, being open to the possibility that you might want to change these pronouns. Perhaps it's a question of just not having been exposed to a different way of thinking. Okay. Primary distinction between liberal and postmodern feminism. And if liberal feminism is still cognizant of the binary, why does that affect its approach to granting freedoms for people? Okay, so liberal feminism tends to be like quite diverse. And to be honest, I wouldn't make the claim immediately that liberal feminists don't that liberal feminists are stuck in the binary, because that would probably be an unfair claim. I can imagine that there would actually be a big subset of liberal feminists who will say, since it is your choice, then therefore you should be able to designate yourself as any, or you should be able to identify with any of these identities, and that your gender identity doesn't have to be tied to your sex. So to be clear, I do think that there would be liberal feminists who would say that because choice is important to them. I think where they might tend to become a bit more conservative is less in, I guess, less in the content of their feminist theory and more in terms of the strategies that they choose to defend. So even if they might say on principle that their position is, I guess that their position is inclusive and that their position does not prescribe heterosexuality, because the methods that they choose to espouse are, some would say, a bit more conservative and modest, which involves like really working within the law, really working within legal structures, then by default, the delta of change, I guess, is smaller, or by default, they end up working within those categories that even if they don't intend to reify or fix these categories, they inevitably end up doing, because they're not trying to like change like they're not trying to like overhaul laws or like do something like very radically activist, right? So if you're trying to propose for change through pre-existing structures and pre-existing accepted norms, then you end up kind of like reinforcing it. So for example, the advocacy for same-sex marriage, right, inevitably still legitimizes like marriage as an institution between two individuals, or even the phraseology of it as same sex, right? To them, that is still transgressive because they're fighting for choice. But the specific battles that they pick tend to be the kinds of battles, I guess, that still entrench the binary, if that makes sense. So it's not intentional, but it is just by virtue of the strategies that they tend to prioritize are not very welcoming, or don't tend to open up sexuality as much as the strategies prioritized by postmodern feminists, I suppose, who tend not to be very enamored of legal systems. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. That is a very good question, though, and I'm glad that it gave me the platform to clarify that, liberal doesn't mean you just prescribe the binary. Okay, any other questions? Cool. This is good. And again, I have read about this, but I would not even presume presume to be an expert here, because this is such a, as you yourself say, this is not a discussion that we always have. So I will limit my comments here, because I don't want to, pretend to be an expert on a thing I don't know very well. But it is a good question, which is Indigenous people and gender. We don't really think about it. We seem to kind of just assume that they're conservative and backward. Um, but actually, maybe there's a need to look at these things more thoroughly. What I will say is, there is, I don't want to generalize about Indigenous groups, but there is enough data to suggest that for some situations, the conceptions of gender are a bit different to the binary conception that Western societies seem to privilege, or at least Western colonial societies seem to privilege. So, in the context of the Philippines, pre-colonial Philippine society, I don't want to romanticize it also, but pre-colonial Philippine society tended to have more liberal or more, it would be transgressive to us now, but norms when it came to female sexuality. So it wasn't also like monogamy was not necessarily a norm, and sex before marriage was fine. Um, and the figure of the babaylan, for example, in Philippine society is quite well known. Perhaps I should be also like more well versed in what this means, but like tolerance of like gender fluidity or multiple gender identities or non-binary identities or gender presentations or gender expressions that are not consistent with what we would expect them to look like now in relation to someone's designated sex at birth were variable. And there is a lot of data that actually shows that colonial authorities played a hand in imposing more conservative gender norms. So kind of like the aggressive promotion of the Virgin Mary in the Philippines to police Filipino women's sexuality, or the laws on sodomy, for example, in Malaysia and Singapore, are from British colonizers. They're not like native to those populations. Of course, now there's buy-in from the population, right? So obviously that's it would be wrong to say that this is a Western imposition now, but it was a Western imposition when it was introduced, at least. Um, in India, for example, the laws against homosexuality were a British colonial imposition as well. Prior to that, in Hinduism, the concept of gender is really, really fluid and multiple and not prescriptive at all. But the way then Hinduism has interacted with colonial policy has produced this like very conservative conception of gender. So with respect to indigenous societies, I don't want to downplay um, the data that we have that show that not more than the rest of mainstream society, but there are concerning instances of things like domestic violence or practices that we would code as abuse against children, for example, like early marriage or um, early sexualization of children or women, which I'm not going to claim that these are pervasive, but they have been observed. So that is something to think about as well. And there have been writings by indigenous women as well who talk about quite patriarchal norms within their societies, or like how, but then you also have work that shows that these norms are quite egalitarian. So I think my answer would be it really depends on which indigenous groups, what their histories are like, what cultural specificities might exist, and which members of the group we are talking to. Like, are they among the elites in the group? Are they like the less elite members of the group? So I know that this isn't like a direct or clear-cut answer. I suspect what I trying to do with my answer is agree with you about how complex it is and how important it is to have these conversations, ideally led and driven by members of these communities themselves, which is also partly why I'm a bit uncomfortable weighing in about it, because I do think that the best people to speak about it would be individuals who are part of these communities. Any other questions? So Filipino expats and the identities they associate with. So to be honest, I probably don't know enough about this to really say much beyond perhaps one thing. So it depends where they travel. There's this identity that has been critiqued as well in queer studies, right? Of the cosmopolitan global gay. So, but I don't want to suggest that this is not a natural identity necessarily. But if you a big concern of like members of a diaspora, right? Like when we go overseas, and I do consider myself as part of the diaspora, but I am not a member of the gender minority, and I recognize the privilege imbued in that. But like, is how do you then kind of find a way to fit into that new society you're in, especially if it tends to be like a more cosmopolitan and urban location, so like capital cities around the world, for example. How do you fit into that, and how do you like in some ways, how do you internalize that cosmopolitan identity? And that intersects with LGBT identities sometimes. So this whole like idea of the like high earning middle class global gay who is not is a bit more, so in terms of presentation is very different to the members of the LGBT community that you would encounter in the Philippines, for example, or like in lower income groups. So a huge contrast that people make, and I really dislike these contrasts, and especially don't feel qualified to delve into them. But it's like your parlor gay versus like your, you know, gay expat in a Manhattan bar who's like presenting in a slightly masculine way, who goes to the gym and who's like very buff and well built and like has all these like fancy skincare products. And their presentation to the world is quite different, like that they're tapping into very different kinds of identities, right? So that might be an example, but it's a bit abstract, I think. Otherwise I might just not comment on this because this is not a question that I'm very familiar with. Okay, we'll talk about sex work in the next. So the question was about how to defend sex work. We'll talk about sex work in the next section, because it is one of the case studies. Anyone else? All right, let's move to section 2, because that is also quite robust and I don't want to like keep you here forever. I will now share my screen for section 2. All right, so like I said, I will assume that we all have background knowledge at this point, and we're going to talk about slightly more nuanced, I guess, conceptions of agency and choice. First question, why do we care so much about choice when it comes to women and gender minorities? Why are a lot of our debates really like fixated on choice in these situations? I think the short answer is women and gender minorities, although some of them who pass for cis, even if they are not cis, right, but pass for cis, sometimes escape some of these restrictions, but not always. Women have historically been deprived of freedom, right, through a combination of formal and informal regulations. I would like to stress the weight of informal regulations here, and this is where I kind of break with some liberals, which is I don't think formal law change necessarily guarantees actual improvement in people's quality of life, because like the law on the books is very different from the law in practice. And sometimes culture, if you ask me, has the weight of law, because if cultural norms are so strong, then they kind of are like default the law in that community as well. Anyway, I digress. So historically deprived freedom in terms of access to voting, restrictions on movement. In my work, I find that societies are more likely to restrict women's movement rather than men's movement because of a conception of women as more vulnerable, and more likely to be endangered when they are away from the home. And second, because of fears and anxieties around women becoming more cosmopolitan or free, the fear that it is going to ruin the traditional family if women go on their own and internalize more like urban ideas. So this fear of like the unknown, and the progressive woman. Interestingly enough, when we talk about restrictions on migration, there tend, or even just like household conversations, parents tend to be less willing to send like women kids to university overseas than they are there, or to allow them to stay out late than they are their kids who are men, right? um or migration policies, for example, for the Philippines, have a lot of restrictions for female migrants in terms of the tests they have to pass, the trainings they have to undergo before they're allowed to like work overseas. Reproductive and domestic burdens are not distributed equally. We've had this chat earlier. Economic restrictions, so restrictions on property ownership or working outside the home, or even if these restrictions aren't formal, if you have higher domestic and reproductive burdens, then your ability to work outside the home in some ways is kind of limited, or to succeed in that work, right? um, Restrictions on speech and dress, which are both again formal and informal. We've talked about, Hillary being punished for behaving a certain way or saying certain things. There are some things men are more likely to get away with saying rather than women, um, even if this is not enshrined in law. Denied political representation or ability to advocate for themselves, denied sexual and reproductive rights. So this is a shared experience between like people, women and gender minorities, right? I mean, obviously another problematic thing here, and this leads me to the sex work debate, laying the groundwork for that, is because of all these historical injustices, there's a tendency to apply the identity of victimhood to women and to kind of just like see them as passive actors, as people who have not been given access to information and power. But this danger there is then to also see them as incapable of adjudicating their best interest. And once you start locking people into subject positions of victims, whether they internalize this or not, right? That kind of also therefore then lays the groundwork for, if you create identities of victims, and you also create identities of rescuers. And who do these rescuers often look like? They are often white men. That's where the problem lies. If you think about, and that's why I don't really like the victimhood identity, and I'll talk about this in a bit, but if you also think about a lot of Western interventions in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, women's rights was one of the things that they waved around. But really, did the material conditions of women in these societies improve? No, but it kind of just made these Western countries kind of like asserted that they were morally superior because they are presumably more gender equal than these barbaric backward countries where we kind of need to save brown women from brown men, essentially. Even the deployment, to be honest, of gay rights in some quarters is quite problematic like this. So at one point, the US military, less so under Trump, was trying to demonstrate that they were more progressive than militaries in other societies because they were more welcoming of LGBT individuals or even just female soldiers. So this whole and you've heard of the argument, the pink washing claim, right? Where Israel is thought of as, styling itself as more progressive in terms of LGBT rights relative to Arab neighbors. but in a way that obscures the very real systemic violence that is committed against Palestine. So sometimes this whole deployment of progressive rhetoric, like in the same way companies do it and corporations do it, saving these victims, but actually masking other more structural forms of abuse. So I just like very wary of this rhetoric of victims being saved. All right. Anyway, that little rant will probably get clearer when we talk about the case studies. Let's unpack the word agency, which we hear a lot. Some of what I'm going to say here is going to be potentially useful, not just in debates, but perhaps in your academic work for some of you who work in these fields. Okay, I saw another question. We'll deal with that in a bit. So in terms of agency, one thing I want to emphasize is agency is not the same as action, right? Not everything someone does is agentic. If someone held a gun to my head right now and forced me to do a thing and I did that thing, I would have been doing an action. That would have been an action, but that wouldn't have been an agentic action because I would have been like on face, coerced into doing that, right? So agency not same as action. Agency also not the same as being liberal. And this is where sometimes people talk about the liberal bubble in debating, right? Like we can be making choices that end up conforming to or upholding existing social norms that you and I might not approve of, but those actions can still be agentic. Like in the same way, we recognize that, you know, let's say like a man who chooses to beat their partner is acting in an agentic way, even if we don't approve of the content of their actions, right? So we tend to make this mistake sometimes in feminism to kind of just say, no, no, that's a false consciousness. You don't know that you are being oppressed by the choices you are making. You're a dupe of power. In a narrow set of situations, this might be true, but we tend to be using it more than we should, especially in relation to religious women or sex workers. And Saba Mahmood, a theorist, did say she studied the practices of veiling of women in Egypt, and her argument is, look, we shouldn't always assume that the self or the subject is a liberal subject in the same way like an enlightenment man, right? Like these women are constructing themselves in a way that increases their happiness, increases their self-actualization, makes them feel like they're doing what is necessary to have it to be better members of their religious community and to have a better relationship with their God. And if veiling is part of that set of choices that they make, that is agentic. There is agency in that choice, and we shouldn't be like trying to stop them all from doing it, right? I make a similar argument about sex workers, which we can talk about later in the case study. So the best explanation of agency that I've heard thus far is from Shoden, which is having agency involves both deliberating on choices and having choices on which to deliberate, right? So autonomy, an individual capacity to act, hence the gun example, and freedom, conditions that facilitate action. So when you're trying to analyze agency in life or in debates, what do you look at? You look at the subject who acts and the conditions within which they operate, right? Particularly, how are their self-understandings produced? So you don't take the self-understanding as given, right? Because that in itself is a site of power. So you're like, okay, I seem to have these very strong priorities or desires. Where did these come from? Why do I understand the world to be this way? Why do I understand my obligations in this situation to be this way? So the ability to reflect on that is part of agency, right? So not just the action, but also the reflection of the conditions in the first place. Two things about agency that I think are important is the development of agency is a lifelong process. It's very hard to assess it in terms of like snapshots of behavior. So it's very hard to say, I am choosing to focus on this particular period in your life over the last few days or something and make an assessment of agency in that context. You could, but that is not like an authentic or I guess like a meaningful understanding of agency in a in terms of like how you would characterize that person's life condition, right? And this is a topic that I really struggle with in my dissertation because I talk about sex work and trafficking. And my position is sex work is work. There's a small subset of sex workers that are abused, and that might be a trafficking situation in the same way that this is true of domestic work or factory work or uh, agricultural work, but that doesn't characterize the entire sector or category of workers. Now, what about those humans then, those women usually who were uh, introduced to the sex trade when they were minors? In that situation, that is a clear-cut case of trafficking, right? The law is quite clear. If you are a minor, regardless of whether you indicated consent, it is trafficking. So they started when they were 14, 12, 16. But when I have met them and I'm talking to them, they are in their 30s and their 40s. And they continued to engage in sex work until then, even when there was an absence of coercion, right? They could have left anytime. They were not locked or trapped or abducted. There were no pimps or like, actually the term pimp is racialized. There were no third parties that were, forcing them to do it. They chose to stay on at 30, or they left for a while and then they came back to it. Now, to me, the person that they were at 12 is very different to the person that they were at 30. And it would be overly simplistic to say you are the same person. And between 12 years and 30 years, there has been no change in your agency. So, how do you assess that? And my tentative assessment might be there was a lack of agency, and that was a form of coercion in the beginning, but now this is not as coercive, and this is a mixture of consent and coercion. And it is a lot more complex than a very flat characterization of abuse, victimization, right? So we are very different people at different points in our lives. The next thing about agency, and this is where I disagree with the liberal feminists a lot, is I think agency is intersubjective. I do not think um, I do not think this process of gaining agency is one that an individual does on their own. A lot of how we make sense of the world happens based on our interactions with others. In the same way, our decisions do affect others. And with sex workers, part of the reason they are disadvantaged, I think, is because their work is criminalized, which means it becomes hard for them to collectivize, right? To either unionize or to even just like have safe spaces where they can get together as a political organization or as a collective to talk about their experiences and to make sense of it, and to attach meaning to it, right? That is part of agency, like having that vocabulary, like recognizing something as real and being able to explain the processes behind it. That's why the Me Too movement was valuable, because it allowed individuals to come together and say, this happened to me, this happened to you. Oh, this is an experience that is obviously each experience is unique to a person, but this seems to be more common than we realize. This is valid, this is real. I'm not the only one. So, this meme of I feel seen, right? Now, agency also involves our ability to influence the way the world understands us, our identities, and our experiences. So the people and the way knowledge is produced and the way knowledge is shaped, because knowledge is power, yeah? So the way we understand prostitution now is shaped by NGOs, certain kinds of feminists, most of them not sex workers with no experience of sex work whatsoever, who have only talked to the small subset of sex workers who were abused. So in that case, they would be women in prostitution, not sex workers, because they did not choose that. So, and is shaped by like donors and conservative groups. The church plays a really important role in this, right? So if your knowledge is shaped by those groups, and that is how collective understandings of certain phenomena are shaped, then that is a lack of agency for the groups that were excluded from these processes of producing knowledge. And you get excluded from a process of producing knowledge if in the first place you're not able to, within your group, come together and make sense of the world and then shape the world's collective understanding of your experience, right? So that's why I guess this goes back to the discussion of women-only spaces. Again, I mean this in not cis women only spaces, or spaces for women and gender minorities to come together and shape their experiences and tell the world their narrative, right? Um, so I think agency is not individual. I think agency is intersubjective. Um, which brings us to, also please realize that there are no objectively correct views in feminism. So obviously you are talking to me and I have certain ideological inclinations that I will be conscious of, but sometimes not even fully conscious of. So please don't take my words as gospel truth. Um, now, in terms of the self versus society issue, which always comes up in debates about agency, to be honest, I think this distinction of the self versus society is a lie. We are lying to ourselves if we think that there's like some inner core, like inner space that we have that is untouched by the world, or that is not in a way constituted by discourses around us or the power around us. Like, that just doesn't exist. My argument is we are all shaped by the norms or discourses or material realities around us from the moment we are born. Like we just talked about, like being designated as male or female. That's not something we chose. And yet it was put upon us. We choose it after the fact, retroactively perform that role that was designated. But we had no say in that designation, right? And so power is not always visible or direct. It may act upon us in ways that we don't recognize. We will never be able to fully know or recognize the powers that are acting upon us. This is quite bleak. And so, I mean, does this then mean that we have no freedom and that, resistance is impossible given this very like bleak view that I have of power? No. But it means it's a lot more complex than I can choose, to be free and I can choose to discard and accept things, or that I am always making a fully informed choice. No one is ever making a fully informed choice. What it means is resistance grows out of the very situations we are in. So that same situation you are in where you are socially produced is the same situation where you kind of like find ways to remake yourself or to change your relationship to social norms or to resist them. We're never going to be able to fully resist them, but at least to partially resist them, right? And the only way is really to accept that social tension. There will be some degree of social determinism in our lives that we will never be able to transcend, but we can still understand at least the forces acting upon us, which is why feminism really values consciousness raising. Sometimes you can't fully change a norm, but at least being aware that it's acting upon you, right? So I identify as a feminist, and this is a thing I have been doing in my scholarships. I have been working to understand these processes, but I'm not free of them. So I am aware historically of how much, women's bodies have been policed in terms of like us being told what we can wear, but also like in terms of like weight and shape and size. And I know that standards of beauty are very racialized in terms of valuing features that we associate with, Caucasians. I also know that policing women's weight is a way of disciplining female bodies, and that actually there is no inherent better weight, right? Like at certain points in history, more weight was desirable. Certain points of history, thinness is desirable. I know all of this, and yet at the same time, I can't fully escape these norms. I also get unhappy when I put on weight. And even if I know how oppressive and how violent that is to myself and to other women, by talking about it, by talking about losing weight, I am propagating a norm that says that thinness is desirable. And I know all of that, but I can't always stop myself from doing that. I can try. And that's what I mean by remaking ourselves, right? Being aware of the norms and our relationship with those norms. Sometimes that's all you can hope for. At least that you are not uncritically accepting all of these norms, even if you accept their hold over you. And as feminists, sometimes we have to pick our battles, right? Like, I am trying to fight so many battles that sometimes I don't have the willpower or the headspace or the emotional resources to say, I will make a statement and leave my house without makeup. Because if I'm trying to fight one battle, perhaps makeup makes me feel a bit more confident when I am fighting that battle. But at least being aware of why that is so is in a way already restructuring those norms, and even if not fully, but at least like partially subverting them, which applies to sex work too. We will talk about that in a bit. All right. Now, what is freedom in light of all of this? I get this from Shoden again, who to me provided the best argument, really. Freedom refers to the structural conditions of life options individuals face in achieving their goals. So this can refer to material conditions, this can refer to norms and discourses, right? As we've talked about, if you are a woman and you grew up being told that marriage and children is absolutely an essential part of your life, it should be your goal when you're in your late 20s. In the absence of these things, you have failed as a woman, you have led a less fulfilling life as a woman. That restricts your freedom, because that is a norm that kind of narrows your conception of what's possible or acceptable in your life, even if you don't realize it. It's foreclosing other possibilities. So that in terms of the raw materials that you have to work with to be the best version of yourself, your raw materials are limited because your imagination has been limited by this norm. Does this mean you can't transcend it? You can, and a lot of women have. But I just want to highlight the role of norms here. That these restrictions are not just material. They're also restrictions on what we can imagine, what we are allowed to imagine, right? So agency is greater when individuals can choose from viable options to improve their lives and fulfill their needs and desires. So, and as I said, more options good, but also to understand how the desires are formed. Now, what if all the options are bad? Enter sex work, right? One thing I will say now, and then we leave it at this first, we build on that later, is even if the options are bad, we shouldn't immediately assume that someone doesn't have the opportunity to reflect critically on their options. So even if someone is faced with bad options, that doesn't make them dumb, right? And this is a mistake a lot of people make. We're like, oh, you don't know what's good for you. Poor person's going to be like, hell no, I know what's good for me. It's just that my hands are tied and I have limited options. That distinction makes a difference. Do we treat people as authorities on their own lives, or do we think that by virtue of them being in bad situations, they cannot make good decisions anymore? So a lot of times, for example, people shame poor people for poor financial decisions, like, why is your diet so bad? Or why are you not saving? Or why are you buying that tingy mentality, for example, in the Philippines? Like, why are you buying small quantities of a thing? Everyone knows that buying in bulk allows you to save. And the response is, obviously, I know that, but I don't have the capacity to buy in bulk. Or, obviously, I know that cupcake is unhealthy. It is cheaper. Like, sugary things are just cheaper than healthier things. Or obviously I know that it's unhealthy, but I have spent the rest of my day using my willpower to go through 3 minimum wage jobs and do the housework, and I have no more willpower to like resist a cupcake, right? Like, people are not stupid, actually. It's just that we are not fully aware of the limitations or the context in which these decisions are being made. So in light of that, my intervention, to me as a feminist, I think the most important question we should be asking is, how do we increase freedom? And I will explain this a bit more in the next few slides. What is an oppressive situation? Because a lot of debates are about oppressive situations. They're not about situations where people have, full access to choice and full access to resources, because what's controversial there, right? It's about oppressive situations where women or individuals do not, so this can apply to men in some cases, and certainly to gender minorities, do not have a wide range of choices. And there are penalties for transgressing the rules. So if you don't do as expected, you are likely to be either punished under the law or punished under the community judgment practices or cultural norms. You're ostracized from your community, you're kicked out of your family, you lose your friends, or in some cases, the punishment might be even internal because you have internalized it so much that you end up loathing yourself and you can't live with yourself. So there are penalties for transgression. That's an oppressive situation. In these situations, I want people to realize that overt resistance is really, really hard, but that doesn't mean there's no resistance or there's no agency. So we need to recalibrate the way we assess agency in these situations. You are a farmer working in a land that is owned by your employer, and your family also lives on that land, and they too are dependent on that employer for their jobs. A clueless person is going to say, if it was so bad, then you would have revolted. Well, no, because if you revolted, then there would have been a real risk of injury or a real risk of further marginalization if you got kicked out of the land. In fact, you know your situation better than that idiot who's making that comment, which is precisely why you are not openly revolting, right? And that is why, in that case, perhaps a better judge assessment of agency would be to speak to these individuals themselves to understand what their calculus is, or to locate resistance or agency in other practices, not in overt resistance, but if you ask them how they conceive of their life situation and how they conceive of their choices might be a better example. So this thing about sex work, which I really, really dislike, people are like, oh, you don't see women coming forward and talking about how sex work is a choice. And I'm like, how? If they come forward and tell you that, you will judge them. Or in some cases, put them in jail because what they're doing is illegal. So simply telling you, so a lot of times with sex workers, unless you are a good researcher who knows how to navigate these things and to make your respondents feel safe, they're just going to tell you what they think you want them to hear. They're just going to tell you, of course, I did not want to do this. I was forced into this, because those are the only acceptable answers that they're allowed to give, right? Because otherwise they get stigmatized. Imagine if a sex worker said, nah, I chose this. Yeah, I prefer this to washing dishes. I think I'm too pretty to be scrubbing toilets, which, by the way, they have said to me. How will the interviewer judge that unless the interviewer is coming from a place of non-judgment, right? Or a fear that researchers might be involved with the police, which is why you would never openly acknowledge that you chose this independently. So in that cases, we must recalibrate our metric for how we are judging and assessing agency. It cannot be overt action. It cannot be overt displays of resistance. We'll have to look at something else. And so, as I've said, all options here involve a potential degree of harm to self. And these choices are, as you said in the question, considered a forced choice and not really a valid choice. And it varies. Oppressive situations vary in extent, obviously, and context is very, very important. So some types of sex work fall under this, not all, to be honest. You have a lot of high-end escorts who are very attractive. Like within Cambridge and Oxford, there are escorts who control the terms of their transactions, who are able to screen their clients, who make up to £5,000 for one evening. Like, I don't think they fall under oppressive situations, to be honest. So we're talking more about street and bar and establishment-based sex workers, perhaps. Poor women and microloans, domestic work, religious dress codes for women, staying in potentially abusive relationships, not disclosing abuse or violence. These are all like people in oppressive situations, right? How do we assess agency here? How do we deal with these groups in debates? Now, one framework that is important, but not perfect, and I also criticize it, is the framework of adaptive preferences. So the argument in this framework is persons in situations of deprivation, like what I mentioned, may form adaptive preferences that lead to behaviors that are not in their interest. So these are preferences that are inconsistent with their well-being, formed under conditions not conducive to well-being, but that we can actually expect them to change if they were under conditions that are more conducive to their well-being. right? So if you weren't so oppressed, perhaps your preferences would be different. But because this is the only way of life you know, you end up preferring this way of life. Now you can see how dangerous this logic is when it is misapplied, right? But in this situation, the argument is public institutions therefore have a duty to intervene in the lives of people with adaptive preferences to promote their well-being. And this is usually used in defense of, rescuing sex workers, rescuing people who experience domestic violence, banning the hijab, banning whitening products. Basically, you don't know what is in your self-interest anymore. There are some situations where this is true. We do have individuals who experience Stockholm syndrome, or who are very, very heavily under threat by their oppressors, that there's zero room for choice. I mean, this is why we rescue hostages, right? But I think we need to ask ourselves, who is making these judgments about what is or isn't in a person's interest? And sometimes these judgments can be quite morally laden. And can we ever make these judgments? I think we can, but very, very carefully. And here's my guidance for when and how we make those judgments. Who are the authorities when making these judgments? So my argument is the individuals themselves need to be heavily involved in driving this process. Do not patronize individuals in oppressive situations. Do not assume they do not understand their situation or are incapable of deciding their best interest, even if they seem to reject values that seem self-evident to you. So for me, unless the assessment was heavily driven by a member of that oppressed group, I am unlikely to accept it. And I'm pretty sure that it's probably the incorrect assessment. So we talked about sexual minorities rejecting the marriage discourse, right? Because they don't think it accurately reflects the way they want to engage with the world. So as I say again earlier, the way we understand the problem and the solutions we prioritize must be driven by the target group. Okay, I'm going to talk about 3 case studies: sex work, the hijab, and microloans for women. And after we talk about those case studies, let's break for questions. All right. Sorry, before we go to the case studies, one more slide. So what kind of interventions should we be doing? One, as I said, we must make sure that we actually understand where the oppression is coming from. At the same time, there is a tendency for some postmodern feminists, and here's where I get a bit critical of them, to just put a positive spin on situations and kind of assume that there is subversion or resistance that is happening. So some feminists who defend sex work, and while I defend sex work, I don't agree with this line of defense, who tend to say, oh, no, we are subverting heterosexuality. Now women are in control of their sexuality. We are subverting traditional norms and reconfiguring them. And I'm like, that's a bit dangerous to assume that immediately, because if you talk to sex workers, most of them are not in sex work because they want to subvert norms. Some of them maybe. Most of them are in it for economic survival, right? So let's not kind of like deny also that there are structural, basis of oppression. So that happens actually in debates about hypersexual female celebrities, for example, to go like this very simplistic analysis of, oh, we are now immediately subverting norms. Are we? Or might it be possible that they have to conduct themselves in that way because that is what their record label has asked of them, because that is what seems to sell? And might this not be a decision they're making within the constraints of capitalism and the celebrity market more than some transgressive desire to change sexual norms? At the same time, is there absolutely no space for resistance? There is, right? So when you are doing these debates, I think what's important is to not be overly optimistic or overly pessimistic. To not go, oh my God, no space for resistance. Everything is structurally determined. We are all pawns. But at the same time, to not say, oh my God, resistance and subversion has been completed, because also it's not. A lot of times it's happening in a very incremental way, right? And so the secret to winning the round is to be able to explain in a sophisticated way how those increments add up, I suppose, and then what is the tipping point? How is it true in the case you were describing? Or how is the other side making it worse? So with cosmetic surgery, I suppose if you are arguing that it is a form of resistance or it can be an informed choice, you will have to concede that it is a conditioned choice. Like you can't lie and say, oh, no, 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 this is fully informed. Like women independently arrive at their conceptions of aesthetic and attractive standards. Like that has nothing to do with what society tells them. You kind of have to recognize, no, some of this is because of societal pressures shaped by society. But at the same time, it is also oppressive to force people to live with bodies they did not choose, right? Like either way is coercive. So we would rather pick this form of some degree of coercion because it still allows for some degree of control over coercion that does not allow any control. Might be one way that you break that deadlock. Or with pornography, a lot of women's objections to pornography, feminist objections to pornography, is the working conditions of the porn actors, which is true. Like not all of them have good working conditions, and we need to fight that fight. And second, the content of porn, which seems to normalize like sexual behaviors that are very like how to explain, potentially violent towards women or not actually pleasurable and are very like heterosexual male focused, and in some cases uphold racial stereotypes actually. So as a feminist, my answer to this is, do I think there's a space for resistance here? I do. I think the space for resistance is for feminists to keep changing to keep working on changing what people find desirable or attractive. If they find one thing to be desirable, we change that. It's not the sex acts itself that are problematic. It is the cultural meanings that we attach to these particular acts, and who the owners are and who the creators are. So whose stories are being told, whose preferences are being, I guess, prioritized. And that is where I would intervene in reshaping those things rather than banning porn in and of itself. But fair enough, some feminists are like, but that's impossible to do precisely because it is owned and controlled by a very specific group of people. White men have monopoly over the production of porn. So it's about being able to locate how resistance is possible, but not being lazy and assuming like overly optimistic conceptions of resistance as well. Other types of intervention. So I think in debates about stigmatized communities or oppressed communities, you tend to do well if you are able to illustrate that you are destigmatizing behaviors, that you are contributing to reducing stigma. Stigma is really, really bad because it's dehumanizing for people to go through life like feeling less of a human or being ashamed of who they are, right? That's one. Or hiding who they are and living in secrecy. That affects people's lives. And that's not their fault. It is the fault of the stigma. It is not the fault of the activities they're engaging in necessarily. It is the fault of the stigma around those activities, which is my objection to, saving sex workers. Is the problem the sex work or the stigma around it? Second, stigma is tied to health and safety outcomes. If people feel stigmatized, they're less likely to seek help or to when they feel unsafe or to be able to access like healthcare. And this applies to drug use as well, right? I don't mind stigmatizing certain behaviors like violence. In fact, we should be stigmatizing those instead of other, supposedly immoral practices that are not really immoral. Funny thing is, when I talk to my sex worker interviewees, they make this distinction all the time. They say, look, our work is clean and honest. We don't force anyone to have sex with us. We earn our keep. You contrast us to corrupt politicians or corrupt police people, and all these politicians serving as moral entrepreneurs talking about like protecting women in sex work are among the first ones to pay for sex. So they're like, relative to them, our work is actually clean. Why are we the ones being stigmatized and not them? Very good question. Next, avoid narrowing people's options further. So in development practice, we have this rule called do no harm. I think it's a really important rule. if you are not sure that what you are going to do will make the lives of people better, just don't do it, because you could make it worse. Also, there are opportunity costs because you are using money, resources, political capital, and everyone's energy to do a thing, which therefore means your ability to do other things is reduced because this is the solution that is prioritized. And if it's a bad solution, you either achieve nothing, but you've already had a cost, or you make things worse. Don't do it. So like this whole like rescuing of sex workers, rescuing them, putting them in rehabilitation facilities, and then telling them, oi, maybe you should bake brownies instead, or sew, or I don't know, weave mats, and or like great handicrafts and sell those. But the income from those is significantly less. Plus the labor involved is so much higher. You've just harmed the person. You've just extracted them from a situation that wasn't great, but was comparably still better than the new situation that you have put them in. And what's worse is you probably outed them to their families and their communities. So yes, I'm not arguing that sex work is amazing and we should all start doing it, although more power to you if this is your thing. I am arguing that it is actually possible to do harm if we go in and intervene without understanding the context. Or if we prioritize certain interventions that reduce freedom rather than interventions that increase freedom. Cool. All right, first case study, sex work. This is the topic of my PhD dissertation, so I will try my best to not be super carried away. A big question here is selling sex inherently degrading and dehumanizing? Is it different from any other form of labor? Some sex workers will say, no, it is just the same as any other form of labor. I don't think I am selling my body. I don't think I'm selling myself. I am just selling a sexual service. Afterwards, it's done. My body is still with me. Fair. And to be honest, I would trust people to be in a better position to talk to us about their relationships with their bodies rather than concluding that we have a specific relationship with our body. Fair enough, though, some of them do agree that sex work is different from other types of work. For them, sex is a bit more intricately connected to our sense of self and our sense of identity than other actions that we may perform, like dancing or gardening or being an athlete, which all involve the use of bodies, right? For them, sex is a bit more intimate and a bit more personal. So there's a bit of yourself they feel that you are kind of selling or at least exposing in sex work that you are not doing for these other occupations. So again, not all sex workers agree on what their relationship is with their bodies, right? So the law against sex work is kind of just premised on the assumption that everyone has the same relationship with their bodies, that we all feel exploited and dehumanized and exposed when we have to transact in sex with our bodies. Not all sex workers feel that. Some of them do. But even for them who do, the next question is, it's not the most fun thing, but what are their realistic alternatives? And for the women who I've interviewed, sadly, it was only women that I got to interview because I released a call for interviewees and only women responded. And it wouldn't be ethical for me as a researcher to, to go up to people and say, hi, I think you're a sex worker. Would you like to be interviewed? That's invasive. I can only wait for those who respond to me. It's possible that it was only women who responded because they feel more comfortable with a woman researcher. What are the realistic alternatives? So some of the women I spoke to used to work as domestic workers. Now, if you think about it, domestic work, your minimum wage in the Philippines, in NCR, in Manila, is 4,000 pesos a month. You are away from your family, you're staying in someone else's home, raising their kids, and you're vulnerable to abuse. If you go overseas, your minimum wage is supposed to be 400 USD a month, but that's a lie. Usually you're given a different contract to sign when you get there. It's only 200 USD a month. And to get there, you've paid so much in placement and training fees and your flights, such that your first 2 or 3 months are usually spent paying back that debt. And you are in a foreign country with foreign employers. I mean, the Middle East is our top employer in the Philippines, right? And different language, different culture, in a private space with a foreign family with no way to defend yourself. Obviously, the laws prefer their own citizens rather than migrants. I mean, we know about how migrants are heavily abused in these countries. Your identification documents are with your employer. Your legal status is tied to your employer. So it's not even a free market, right? Your employer can look for another employee, but you can't go around looking for another employer. You'll get sent back. And you get exposed to emotional, physical abuse. Also, the guilt that you feel from being away from your own family so that you can send them back money, but you miss important events in your kids' lives, their graduation, their first communion, when they had a bad day at school, their first breakup. There's so much guilt that migrant workers feel. So alternatives, work in factories. I mean, you come in at 7 a.m., you leave at 6 p.m., salary deductions every time you're late or absent, very limited bathroom breaks, unsafe working conditions, sexual harassment from your bosses, arthritis, back pain, all of these things. Work in retail. How much do you really get paid for retail? And endo is really popular in the Philippines, right? Like the SM model of limited term contracts so that employers can get around obligations to permanent employees. I mean, this was what the women told me. They were like, we worked in those other occupations before. Some of them require college degree. We don't have college degrees. Many of them were single mothers. So flexibility in their schedule was really important because they needed time to care for their kids. Or if their kids are sick and they missed work from a factory, they got fired, right? Which doesn't happen in sex work because it's more flexible. And actually the hourly rates are higher. So they make the equivalent of what a domestic worker would make in a month, in a week, or under that. Now, when these women are giving me these facts, am I going to tell them, no, actually, I know better than you, that you are better off in a factory rather than selling sex? That's dumb. And that's feminist arrogance, right? So that particular situation, I will defer to the individual and their judgment of what's better for them. Now, do I think it is necessarily enjoyable work? Are they happy all the time? Absolutely not. Some of them have to interact with abusive pimps, third parties. Some of them have to interact with really unpleasant clients. They're obviously exposed to danger and all of that. I understand this, and we'll have a chat about that in the next bullet point. But at the same time, in their assessment, this is still a better situation than the alternatives that are being provided to them. So I also think it is a bit like moralistic to like ask sex workers, do you actually enjoy your job? I mean, we don't ask it of a McDonald's employee. We don't ask it of a cleaner, right? Like for some people, enjoying their job in the way we enjoy the work we do, in the way I enjoy being a PhD student, is just not possible. And it would be a bit elitist to suggest that that is true only of sex workers. Like that is a weird burden we are putting on sex workers that we're not putting on anyone else. Admittedly, there are safety concerns, right? Lack of control over working conditions. Now, the question is, where does it come from? And my argument is it comes from criminalization, not inherently from sex work. Because it is an illegal work, like illegal occupation, what happens is the police take advantage of this and extort money from them and sexual services from them all the time in exchange for not being arrested or in exchange for being released. If you talk to sex workers, their biggest fear, I mean, and if they feel comfortable answering the question, their biggest source of threat or fear is not their clients or their managers. It is police. It is the police. And in fact, the worst clients are the police because they don't pay. They feel entitled to women's bodies. They, if it's an ordinary man, sex workers can still get their managers to run after them, or they can, and that's why they get managers to help them screen clients and to protect them against abusive clients, because they are unable to do it on their own and the police don't help them with it, right? Or they can enter into arrangements with hotels or motels to not let the clients leave unless you get a go signal from the sex worker that they have paid. And in exchange for that, you bring business to the establishment, right? Like, or in bars as well, you have bouncers who protect the sex workers from being abused by the clients. Like, when it's the police, though, all bets are off. You can't, because they're ultimately more powerful in the situation. So ask yourself, is criminalization actually helping or harming sex workers? I mean, there's another model that says, because in a world where they are legitimate workers, they can they have legal standing when they file complaints, right? Now, there's another world that says, oh, then why don't we just treat them as victims? We don't punish the sex worker, but we punish the client and the manager. And I'm like, well, that's still silly, because why is that considered protection? That is not what we are doing with domestic workers and factory workers, whom we consider to be precarious workers, right? Our way of protecting them is not to end the industry. It's not that we are canceling their clients or their employers. It's that we are increasing their capacity to protect themselves. So this whole ending the demand as a way of protecting sex workers, to me, is just unpersuasive. You're not ending the demand by ending their business, right? Like, if you have fewer clients, then prices will go down. Where will those sex workers go? We have just explained that the alternatives are not great for them, right? In fact, if prices go down, their desperation increases, which means their willingness to do things that they otherwise would not have done increases. The sex workers have said, I would otherwise not have done anal, I would otherwise have not done BDSM, but I just have one client today instead of 5, so I am more desperate, right? Or they're willing, I guess they're leveraged in screening clients too. Like in the past, they would say, look, if it is legal, then I am not worried because there's a steady supply of clients. So if the client's like, jump in the car, let's go, but something tells me this is dangerous, I am in a better position to say no. But if that is my only client for the night, I might hesitate. Or if I know that we are being surveilled by the police, there's less time to make these assessments because we have to decide on a transaction quickly and become less visible in the public space, right? But if it was, because even if police is only arresting the client because the sex worker needs the business, then the sex worker too feels like they have to hide. So this is what I mean by do no harm and unintended consequences. Sometimes we think that we're protecting people, we are making things worse. Another example is Japanese entertainers, right? Like in the early 90s, we had a lot of Filipino women traveling to Japan as on entertainer visas, but some of them engaging in sex work, some not all, some not all. And so you had this like panic from the US State Department and from some feminists in the Philippines who were like, oh my God, we are sex slaves in Japan. Japan, you must do something. You must protect the Filipinas. So Japan was like, okay, I will do a thing. This is the thing I'm going to do. I will make it harder to travel to Japan. I will therefore require a 2-year licensing fee for training and like professional training so that I'm sure that the women who travel here are indeed professionals and can find high-level professional work instead of engage in sex work. That means I am protecting them. Guess what happened? So the women who went there now had to bear more costs in order to be able to go there because they had to pay for the training fees. So you created an industry for brokers, promoters, and middlemen, right? So when they go there and they're saddled with more debt, what do you think happened? Then they end up trying to do more things to cover that debt, which leads them to do things that they otherwise might not have done. Again, yes, the situation prior to the intervention might not have been great, but perhaps this wasn't the best intervention. Perhaps there had been other interventions that would have been more rights focused rather than restrictions focused, right? The language of rights, has been co-opted by conservative forces to justify restrictions in the name of protecting rights. So we should be very careful about rights as well. The effect on women in general of sex work, fair enough. Some people will argue that if we have readily available sex workers, we might be normalizing the idea that women are sexually available for men. That's not unfair. I have 2 responses. One, it is not the job of sex workers to end the patriarchy. They are the most vulnerable members of our communities. Why does this burden fall on them? No one looks at a factory worker and says, you are complicit in capitalism by working in the factory. So somehow, why is it suddenly the burden of sex workers to end the patriarchy? But second, I actually have a different reading here, which is in a world where sex workers are like given ability to organize, to exercise political agency, to advocate for themselves, and seen as respectable and destigmatized, that also changes the terms under which these sexual transactions happen. And as a matter of fact, we might actually be changing the way we culturally understand sex. We may actually, I think, create more respect for ideas of consent, because in sex work a lot of the sex is negotiated beforehand, what can and what can't happen, how long it will happen for, how much it is worth, right? So that in many ways is actually a more explicit and more empowered way of dealing with sex, assuming all those other background conditions are met that I talked about, than what is happening in the status quo, where in many relationships, it's kind of just like an implied entitlement that men have. So some of my interviewees actually would say, look, I was in an abusive relationship where sex was kind of just expected. And I was beaten, and I could not escape that because I was financially dependent on my partner. Now in sex work, yes, I am also expected to do it for my clients, but this time on my own terms. I get to make money off it, and at least it is a one-off transaction with each client rather than being forever bound to an abusive partner. So to that person, they went from a situation of zero freedom to some freedom, even if not all freedom. So again, who am I to tell her, no, you were actually better off staying with your abusive partner before you entered into sex work, because I can sleep better at night knowing that you are not selling sex for money. Hard, right? Anyway, I can get a bit cranky about this because it is a thing I have spent 4 years researching. Um, so the hijab and banning the hijab, right? What does it mean to those who want to ban it? I think is an important question we ask ourselves. The best case for those who want to ban it is they think that for some women, it is not an informed choice. Even if it is an informed choice for some, for others, it's not, because the cost of not wearing it can lead to things like physical punishment, sexual abuse, job discrimination, like ostracization from your family. So you're not really making an informed choice when you wear it. And so they want to protect that constituency of women who, or the fact that some women are wearing it makes it harder for other women to opt out of wearing it, right? It's also a collective action problem. So they're like, all right, we want to ban it for this reason. Fine. What does it mean though to those who wear it? So as I discussed, it's a mix. For some of them, it is coercive. For some of them, it's not. And there is agency exercised in this decision to wear it. We've talked about that earlier. So how do you adjudicate this debate? I personally am against banning it, actually. I think it's hard to prove the validity of it, partly because I think what's happening here is you have Western liberal groups and you have, all right, these Muslim communities, for example, that value the wearing of the hijab. And both of them are engaged in some degree of like political point scoring or like some political tug of war. And that war is being waged on women's bodies, right? Whereas the women involved don't really get a say in what happens here. No one's asking them what they prefer. We're all just making assumptions about what's good for them, right? Now ask yourself, what really are the consequences of banning? So the best case is, oh yeah, we have protected those who don't want to wear it because now they can blame the state for not having to wear it. It's no longer their choice, it's a choice of the state. But the thing is, does it actually really create more freedom in those situations? Because if the coercion was as grave as we say it was, will the reaction of their communities be to say, all right, then, too bad? No. What's going to happen is their access to public spaces, their mobility is going to be more likely restricted. They might get pulled out of schools. They might not be allowed to stay out late with friends. They might not be allowed to, leave the house without the company of a male relative. So in some ways, perhaps wearing the hijab was like trading off some freedom in exchange for other freedoms. And in a person's adjudication, that was better for them. Like, okay, I'll wear hijab, but this means I can stay out later. I'll wear hijab, but this means I can hang out with my friends, female friends, maybe even male friends, because it is seen as I am still protecting myself and preserving my modesty. My family is more comfortable with me going to work or going to school in a different town if they know I am protected. Now, obviously, that is like problematic in and of itself, but it's not like your alternative was that family will suddenly go, oh, we were wrong. So again, resistance happens within a constrained context. And within that context, sometimes all we are left with is a discussion of what creates a little bit more freedom. That's our life, right? And that's why debates on oppressive situations need to be very attuned to the specific context. All right, microloans, last thing before we break for questions, because I understand we've taken over 2 hours now. My master's dissertations, I can get a bit angsty about this as well. At the moment, more than 90% of microcredit globally, or small loans, are given to women. The assumption, I'll make the best case scenario for this first. It is that women are traditionally excluded from, I guess, the financial services sector, and have a harder time taking out loans because they have less income, they have less property or collateral to borrow with, they sometimes don't have the papers and the documentation necessary to qualify for loans. So we correct that by giving them access to smaller loans. Why smaller? Because they're still higher risk borrowers, precisely because no collateral, right? The basis for this is, if women are able to somehow, I guess, like make an income off those loans, they are more empowered because they have a better fallback position in abusive relationships. They are better able to contribute to the household income and therefore have more leverage in deciding what happens to the household income. Their sense of self-efficacy increases. At the same time, also a lot of literature seems to suggest that women are more effective conduits of aid than men. If you channel aid or poverty alleviation interventions through women, you tend to see better outcomes in terms of education, health, and nutrition for the family, rather than through men who have a greater entitlement to personal expenses like gambling, vices, all of that. That's what the literature seems to say. There's some dispute there. So and the other thing about microcredit to think about is it is becoming a win-win solution, in that it's becoming increasingly commercialized. So the actors that are running it make a profit from it because of the interest rates, which are actually not low, right? And it's seen as a success because we look at it through traditional indicators like loan repayment rates and greater demand for more microloans. Now, I have a slightly more cynical reading based on my interviews with women borrowers of microcredit. One, it's coming at a time where we see a scaling back of state services and privatization. So reduce state expense on healthcare, reduce state expense on education. What's happening is we reduce welfare and we increase solutions that involve individuals helping themselves, right? So we give them money and we're like, you have to pay us back for that, but also we're helping you. But we're taking out all these other things. And that's what I mean by we're displacing other solutions. Because now the dominant paradigm is you've already been helped. You should be responsible for your own welfare. The thing is, this expectation of entrepreneurship, especially for really poor women, is silly. Like, even I would struggle to be an entrepreneur because it's hard to be an entrepreneur. Even if you gave me access to capital and my networks already and the skills that I have, what more someone who doesn't have this social capital and these other intangible resources. So a lot of these businesses do end up failing, right? So why this expectation of and also a lot of the loans end up being used for consumption rather than businesses, because again, the support for consumption has been rolled back, right? But this time, if the business fails, it's your fault. It's no longer the state's fault. Other things to note about microloans is a lot of times, in order to pay back the loans, women go into debt with higher interest loan sharks. So it becomes like a debt cycle, or borrow from another microcredit institution. So this is called loan cross pollution, in order to pay back an initial loan, or to engage in odd jobs to augment their income. So do laundry for neighbors, clean people's houses to make up the shortfall. So the loans are seen as a family entitlement. So men and other members of the family participate in spending the loans, but the repayment is seen purely as a woman's job, right? And that's why they are tied to increased rates of suicide and depression in South Asia. We don't have that data for the Philippines because we're not looking for that data. All we are looking for is increased demand for loans. So obviously your demand for loans will increase if you have less welfare, because that's access to money, even if they know that they are burying themselves in loans. So it's called kapit sa patalim, right? Like whatever access you have at the moment, you will get. And of course, repayment rates are high. In fact, when I spoke to microcredit operators about why women, they said because women borrowers pay, because women borrowers are easier to bully into paying back or to scare or to intimidate. They also tend to be more religious and easier to guilt, whereas male borrowers were more likely to default on loans or to threaten the loan collectors. So, and yes, the women are paying it back, but at what cost sometimes is important to ask. Also, the presence of these businesses means that their working hours have increased significantly, because now they have to run the business, but the household and domestic obligations are not shared. So on top of those pre-existing obligations, you've grafted on new obligations. So sometimes ask ourselves, so these development models end up entrenching a very inegalitarian model of the family anyway? Or are they actually making things better for women? They might be making things better for the family, maybe, but are they making things better for the women involved is less clear. I guess it's making their job as mothers easier, or is it because it's displacing other solutions? At the same time, also, it's being framed as a as an option. We give women the option to access these loans, but in the absence of welfare, it becomes like an exercise of shaming as well. If you're a woman and you don't access the loan, then you are a bad mother, because everyone in your family is like, hey, 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 you're the only one who can get this. Why aren't you getting it? Look, our neighbor, Aling Patring has gotten a loan. Why are you not getting a loan? So is it really a choice in this case, or does the choice become a duty, of telling poor women that they are responsible for getting themselves and their families out of poverty, and in the process also enriching commercial institutions that are lending money? I'm not very sold on this model. I much prefer the conditional cash transfer model rather than this weird microcredit model. Anyway, these are some thoughts on agency and choice. Um, there's one question here. How do you approach debates that subtly call for the movement to prescribe or glorify a certain female archetype? I would couch it in the context of resistance, or a correction to an or to counterbalance like the glorification of a different archetype. So if it's a glorification of sexual female celebrities, so I would say for the longest time, female sexuality was seen as passive, was seen as tied to procreation. Women were not seen as being able to take pleasure in looking good and celebrating their sexuality. So I think the song Wet Ass Pussy would probably come up in a lot of debates, right? And I'd say, look, no one bats an eyelash when male rappers sexualize women in their songs. Why is it that we now have a problem with women doing that? It actually talks about it increases sexual parity, etc., etc. These conditions are obviously not coercive, or if they are, they're not as coercive. If you are meant to be glorifying more traditional roles like caring and housewife, I would say, look, we need to counterbalance a new type of quote unquote modern feminism that seems to emphasize carrierism and shame housewives for choosing to be housewives. And we have betrayed those women as well by, suggesting to them that they are any less empowered, or that their choice is a false consciousness. And so we need to return to that, because we need to support mothers. We need to ensure that society recognizes how valuable their role is, and their contribution is to the family, and to compensate them accordingly. So it's usually, a lot of times, it's about counterbalancing against other norms that are going out of control, or that are being overrepresented, I guess, or bringing to light a specific identity or way of being that is not seen as traditionally feminine, but uh, it might be worth correcting that assumption. So violent women, female protagonists, women as villains, for example, or women in violent sports is a good way to correct against this impression that women are always victims or weak or can't fight men, and obviously explain why it's a good idea to correct those misconceptions as well. All right. Do people have any questions? Although I am mindful that we have run a lot over time.
Feel free to ask a few more questions. I think we can answer probably 2 or 3 more.
So conditional cash transfers to families. So obviously the question is, how do I think these benefit women more? Obviously it depends on what the conditions are, right? But if it is conditional on the school attendance of kids, for example, or on people's willingness to go for checkups or maybe even get vaccinated, it doesn't impose additional work burdens on women that microloans do. Because for microcredit to work, you kind of need to start a business and work, which increases your working hours. So it's an additional obligation, as opposed to uh, one that does not bring with it an additional feminized obligation. It's also just a cash injection that is guaranteed, right? It's not contingent on the success of your business. Because if your business goes under, then you could actually end up losing more money from microloans. And a lot of times it's just like cash injections that these families need or these women need. So there's a lot of data that shows that austerity measures that the Philippines adopted, thank you IMF and World Bank, during the 1997 financial crisis, had very gendered effects. So if you're a woman and you're traditionally expected to ensure that there's enough food and access to healthcare in the family, and obviously the budget for that is shrinking because of price inflation and because your partner probably lost their job, and reduced like state subsidies for these things, right? That burden falls on you to make ends meet. That burden falls on you to look for work elsewhere. And a lot of times, like the common stereotype you have, if there's not enough food on the table, who is the human more likely to give up their share of the food? Traditional expectation is the mother. So a lot of these things that involve austerity and belt tightening don't explicitly say it, but they implicitly rely on expected sacrifices that women are willing to perform in the household. If you have reduced access to healthcare for elderly individuals or childcare, on whose shoulders will that burden fall most likely? Older female children or women in the household. So I think sometimes the solution really is just give people money. Like people are so averse to this, but give people money. Fine, make it conditional on a few things. But ultimately, I don't understand this point of like not trusting people with money. Or alternatively, you can give them goods and services, although the space for corruption there is higher, as we have seen in procurement. Any other questions? I may actually have to go as well to another meeting. So
All right. We can wrap this up then. So thank you so much. I will end screen and I will just present the certificate. So thank you. That was a fantastically comprehensive and enlightening talk. So I'm sure all our future and present viewers will be grateful that you have graced us with your knowledge. So on behalf of the PDU, the Executive Committee of PDU is to award Sharmila Parmanand the Certificate of Appreciation for sharing her time and expertise in the second edition of the PDU workshop. So just a few final reminders for anybody who is still checking in. The stream will be edited and uploaded to the PDU Workshop YouTube channel. You could check in there with other lectures on different topics. You can also follow our PDU page for updates on our future speakers and topics. And most importantly, let's show our gratitude to our excellent and gracious speaker for her incredible lecture. I'm sure I speak for all of us here when I say that your work here will pay off for generations after our own. So we are super appreciative of your generosity. Thank you so much.
And thank you.
All right, everyone, you may please leave the Zoom call now and we will end the stream. Thank you.